Good morning. This is session 4 of the Gospel according to Matthew, and we will look perhaps not closely enough at Matthew's chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. This is the Church of the Redeemer in Ruston, Louisiana in the United States. But today we will attempt to look at Matthew 8, 9, 10, and 11. You're familiar with this timeline of the Gospels. Jesus was born between 6 and 5 BCE, it is believed. It is now believed. He was killed and was resurrected in either 30 or more, perhaps more likely 33. My teacher, Robert Jewett, calculated the death of Paul during the reign of Nero the Emperor at 62. The Jewish War was between 66 and 73, and during the Jewish War in 70 CE, the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. Probably not long after 70, the Gospel according to Mark was written, and if you believe that Mark was first, in other words, if you believe that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, then you place Mark first chronologically, and so after that, perhaps around 80, you would date the Gospel according to Matthew. So that means that both Matthew and Luke are late first century Gospels. But nonetheless, when you compare other biographical works from the ancient world, having a biography written just a few years later or just a few decades later after the life of the person that is being written about, that is very striking. That's very soon. According to the ancient world. And so what's really important about the New Testament Gospels, at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if not also John, were written in the same century as Jesus. And so that means that if you are interested in the whole issue of, when you read the Gospels, is this history? Is this actually history? You would sort of like to know when the Gospel was written. And so the earlier you date the Gospels, theoretically, then the more likely you're reading historical matter when you read the Gospels. For a moment, let's turn over to the very famous preface to the Gospel of Luke. And let me read the first 4 chapters of Luke for you. And then I will talk about what that means. I'm looking at Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. This is the NRSV I'm reading from. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too have decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. Note that the writer of Luke does not say that he or she was an eyewitness. He said he is writing an orderly account. He's saying that he investigated it carefully. And that suggests that he didn't think necessarily that his predecessors who have written Gospels investigated theirs carefully, because he also says many. How many is many? Many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us. And now I'm going to do it carefully or accurately. The King James Version said diligently, but it means carefully or accurately. But he says that he got the information from people who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, people who handle the word, in other words, preachers. Just because you have it in a gospel does not necessarily suggest that the Gospels were eyewitness accounts. But I do think that in the Gospels there is quite a bit of very early material. The earlier the material in the Gospels, the closer it is to Jesus. and so the more accurate it is likely to be. I'm thinking of Craig Keener's relatively new book, Christobiography, in which he defends the basic historicity of the Gospels. And that's a book that I need to really master as I am working on my book on Mark. So that's an important issue, namely, when you read the stuff in the Gospels, it used to be the only issue. In the early 20th century and even the mid-20th century, it was practically the only issue. The issue was, okay, this passage that you just read from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, did it actually come from the historical Jesus? That was the question. Now we ask other questions, but that historical question, as far as I'm concerned, has never gone away. My view of Matthew is that the final editor of Matthew was a Gentile. This is probably a minority view. But nonetheless, the final editor of Matthew had a very strong respect, perhaps a reverential awe for the sources, knowing that the earlier the sources that Matthew, the writer of Matthew, drew upon, the closer they were to the historical Jesus. And therefore, Matthew has this reverential awe. You know, when something happens in the life of Jesus, you have the quotation formula. These things happen in order that the words of the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled, saying, and then you have the quote. And so there is a reverential awe of the Old Testament. You would not have to be Jewish to have this reverential awe for the Old Testament. But also when you look at particularly the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, material which clearly comes from Jewish Christianity in a variety of ways, and it portrays Jesus as a rabbi, Jesus as a teacher of Torah. Matthew, in my view, has done very little editing of that material. Whereas, when you look at most of the Markan material that is taken up into Matthew, there is very profound editing that takes place. And of course, if you want to know what the editing is, you have to get a book like this. This is the Greek-English one, and it's far too expensive, but it's called the Synopsis of the Four Gospels. And we have the other one, Synopsis of the Four Gospels, just the English. And it's a little less expensive than this one. But anyway, what's really good is when you look in a synopsis, you see the first column is Matthew, the second column is Mark, the third column is Luke, and when there is a John parallel, the fourth column is John. And so you can actually compare it word for word, either in an English synopsis or preferably in a Greek synopsis. And when you see, for example, Matthew changing Mark in a certain way and fixing Mark's Greek in a certain way, after you see that, 10 times or whenever, and you see the editing that Matthew has taken place of Mark to bring that Markan material into Matthew, then that gives you an idea of the editing that has taken place by the final editor of Matthew. And you have to realize that Matthew loves to edit Mark. On the other hand, Mark is the skeleton of Matthew. You have this, and the skeleton of Luke too, because you have the infancy narratives at the beginning and you have the resurrection accounts at the end. So there's a profound editing of Mark. On the other hand, there's a big respect for Mark. And so my view is that Matthew, the final editor of Matthew, has a great deal of respect for his sources because the writer of Matthew realizes that the sources that really come, much earlier in the first century are that much closer to Jesus. Okay, we're going to look at Matthew 8 through 11, and we have a bunch of miracle stories. And then we also have, particularly in chapter 10, we have the authorization and sending of the disciples in Matthew 10. And then in Matthew 11, there's material about the relationship of Jesus to John the Baptist. Okay, Miracle stories in the Gospels were very extensively studied in the early 20th century by scholars doing form criticism, and I will show you a bit of form criticism today. Miracle stories are divided into three types in the New Testament. There are healing miracles, and they are the most prevalent. Healing miracles, miracles of provision, for example, the feeding of the 5,000, and nature miracles. Particularly, the nature miracles are like the stilling of the storm in Mark and Matthew. And so usually the healing miracles in the Gospels are actually form critically the same as exorcisms. Why? Because people in the ancient world believed that disease was caused by daimons. It was caused by intermediate beings, by spirits, unclean spirits as they're often called in Matthew. And so they didn't believe in bacteria, they didn't believe in viruses, they believed in demons. And so in order for Jesus to heal people, Jesus had to cast out demons. And that was what most people believed. That's what physicians did. And there was no real difference between science and magic. There may be less of a distinction between science and magic even in the world that we live in today than many scientists would like to acknowledge, who knows. But the idea is that healings in antiquity were understood to take place because it was some spiritual condition that caused the illness. Some god or some daimon caused the illnesses. By the way, a daimon could be either a good daimon or a bad daimon. And the way to rid the person of the illness is for a more powerful god or spirit, a more powerful daimon, to cast out the daimon that's causing the illness. Okay? We know a lot about this because we've read the New Testament and we've read the Greek magical papyri. So we know a lot about magical spells and we know a lot about how magic worked. Miracle stories, by the way, obviously, were written with the mindset of the Hellenistic age when Jesus and his disciples lived. Some people read the miracle stories today and they say, well, gosh, that can't make any sense. I don't believe that illnesses are caused by demons. I believe in doctors. If I get sick, don't call the priest, call the doctor. Well, most of us do have a different point of view as to what causes illness. But nonetheless, the Gospels were not written, after Dr. Lister, bacteria and all. They are written from the first century point of view. And there are very extensive parallels to New Testament miracle stories in stories about rabbis who did miracles and in the Greek magical papyri. By the way, there are a couple of rabbis from Galilee that did miracles. One of them was Honi the circle drawer. He could draw a circle and make it rain inside the circle. How about that? And a lot has been said about Geza Vermesh's book, Jesus the Jew. And he believed there was a whole category of people who were called Palestinian Jewish holy men. So that book, Jesus the Jew, attracted a lot of attention and a lot of controversy. And it should have attracted a lot of controversy. But the New Testament miracles of Jesus, when you begin to look at the form of the miracle story, and you see the same form in almost all of the miracle stories, then, in fact, that suggests that miracle stories were originally part of oral tradition. In other words, they are stories that could very well have been told orally and told and retold and retold and retold in the early church among early Jesus-believing communities. And once they had been told, they've been told and they have grown some in the telling. But nonetheless, what is important for us is to recognize, if we can, that behind the written miracle story, there is very likely an oral miracle story that was told in the early church. And of course, if you are not able to correlate the written miracle stories in in Mark or Matthew or Luke, and you cannot correlate them with oral miracle stories, and you can't correlate them with earlier sources, then you have a very difficult time correlating them with the historical Jesus. So I think if you're interested in the question of whether Jesus did miracles, you ought to be very interested in whether you can find an oral form behind the miracle stories, the written miracle stories. The form of the miracle stories is like this. Every miracle story does not have every element, but most of them have most of these elements. Matthew loves to put in the crowd reaction. But anyway, you have the setting of the miracle, namely, where was it? Or just how sick is this person, right? What is the problem that these people need this miracle done for them? And then there is the need for the miracle. Oftentimes Jesus learns about the need, or the disciples learn about the need by a dialogue between the healer or the apostles and the person being healed, or the parents or the bystanders. So the dialogue is there, and the dialogue gives you more information about the need for the miracle. And then Jesus encounters the person needing the miracle, and he does the performance of the miracle. And Mark loves to have Jesus say Aramaic words like "be opened," "ephphatha," etc. John has Jesus spit on the ground and make spit and put it on the person's eye in John 9. So there is performance of the miracle, often with gestures, and then lo and behold, the person who was lame can now walk. The person who was blind can now see, right? And then, so the reader is told in the written miracle story that the miracle really happened. And then in Matthew, usually or often in Matthew, there is the crowd reaction, and the crowd reaction is very important because in Matthew wants to show that the people who actually saw this miracle for themselves saw it and they believed. See, the reader of the miracle story can't see the miracle, but the people who were there when Jesus was in person saw the miracle, and when they saw the miracle done, they believed. And therefore Matthew is trying to say, by passing on this miracle story in written form, this is what you should do too. See? So the whole point of the Gospels is to engender and support the faith of the people who are reading the Gospel. In our chunk of Matthew today, from 8:1 to 9:34, there are a bunch of miracle stories. The cleansing of a leper, the healing of the centurion's servant, the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. The healing of Peter's mother-in-law is from Mark. The stilling of the storm is also from Mark, but Matthew puts a very different spin on it. The Gadarene demoniac from 8:28 to 9:1 is a much edited version of Mark 5:1 through 20, where in Mark 5:1 through 20, Mark tells you all of the gory details of just how crazy this man is. He doesn't wear clothes, he's in the tombs, they put shackles on him, they put bonds on him, and he breaks them. And so all of that stuff with the gory details of just how wacko this man is, and also the fact that he is inhabited by multiple demons. My name is Legion. A legio in Latin is as many as 6,000 soldiers. My name is Legio, for we are many. Did you hear that the beginning of that sentence is singular and the end of that sentence is plural? And that's part of the effect of Mark. My name is Legion, for we are many. Okay, is this guy singular or plural? And that's been edited out by Matthew. And then the healing of the paralytic is found in Mark 2:1 through 11. And then you have intercalation. Intercalation is the fancy term for sandwiching. And then Jesus heals 2 blind men, and then Jesus heals a person who is mute. The most interesting, surely, is the stilling of the storm in Matthew. Let's have somebody read that. Bill, would you read that? It's 8:23 through 27. Of Matthew.
Yeah. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But he was asleep. And they went and woke him, saying, "Save, Lord, we are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, O men of little faith?" Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was great calm. And the men marveled, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even winds and sea obey him?"
Keep going.
And when he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes, 2 demoniacs met him, coming out of the tombs, so fierce that no one could pass that way. And behold, they cried out, "What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now a herd of many swine was feeding at some distance from them. And the demons begged him, "If you cast us out, send us away into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go." So they came out and went into the swine. And behold, the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and perished in the waters. The herdsmen fled, and going into the city, they told everything and what had happened to the demoniacs. And behold, all the city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they begged him to leave their neighborhood.
You can see, if you were to read the parallel in Mark 5:1 through 20, that is in the Markan version of it, or the Markan parallel of it, is where you have rather a surfeit of gory and fairly wacko details about just how crazy this man is, and the fact that he has multiple demons, and he ain't too sure whether he's singular or plural. But anyway, Matthew edits that out. And so basically the important thing is Jesus met the man and healed him, and that's all that Matthew wants to convey. Mark is a little bit more interested in just telling you just how crazy the man is, just how wacko this story is. And Matthew is not interested in the goriness and graphicness of the details, but is simply interested in telling the reader, hey, Jesus healed this man. Instead of this man having multiple demons, 6,000 maybe, he healed him and boom, he got better. So Matthew simplifies the miracle story a lot. So that's an important thing. But if you kept going, well, anyway, the whole town came to meet Jesus. They saw him. They begged him to leave their neighborhood. Why did they beg him to leave their neighborhood? Because he's just taken away their income, right? So then after that, you have the healing of the paralytic, and that's not too interesting. You have the Matthean sandwich, or intercalation, where you have the healing of the woman with an issue of blood, a flow of blood. And it is intercalated or sandwiched between Matthew 9:18 through 19 and 9:23 through 25. And so basically there are two healing miracles, one inside the other. But again, if you look back at the form of the miracle story, you can see pretty much the same form, okay? And Mark has just put one inside the other, and Matthew does the same thing. And then when you begin to look at Matthew, much has been made, I think a little bit too much, But much has been made of the 5 long teaching discourses in Matthew. We're all familiar with the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And then in chapter 10, you have the mission sermon, which is what is said by Jesus to the disciples before he sent them out in mission. And then he has a sermon in parables. Then he has in chapter 18 a sermon on the church. And then, of course, the eschatological sermon in Matthew 24, which reproduces Mark 13. You know, there will be wars and rumors of wars. And all this has to take place before the coming of the Son of Man. I cited Raymond Brown's Intro to the New Testament, written in about 1998, published in 1997 or 1998. Which is a very good book to have. I took it with me when I went to Barbados. And then after that, you have the second large block of teaching material, the first large block being the Sermon on the Mount. And now Jesus is discussed as Matthew is dealing with the authority of some of the disciples of Jesus. Some of this material in Matthew 9:35 through 10:42 is from Mark, and some of this material is from Q. And so Matthew has the ability to take Markan material, and I don't have any doubts about Markan priority, but he seems to take Markan material, and Matthew loves to weave it together, almost verse by verse, if not word by word. He weaves it together with material that is in common with Luke. And if you believe in Q, it's a weaving together of Q material into the basic skeleton, which is Mark. I hope that theory is true. That's what I've been teaching for many years. Anyway, if you look at 9:35 through 38, we have a summary of miracles. 9:35, Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. And then he saw the crowds. 9:36, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And these latter three verses, starting with verse 36 and going through 38, 37 and 38, that is Q material. And 9:36 is based on Mark 6:34, but verses 37 and 38 has only the parallel with Q 10:2. By the way, in Luke 10, you have the sending of the 70. And that is assuredly, if there is a Q, that is assuredly Q material. But in 9:37 to 38 in Matthew, the image is the image of the harvest, and laborers working in the harvest. And that suggests to me an apocalyptic background to this Q saying. In other words, God is going to intervene soon. See, there's going to be a direct intervention by God. And the harvest is evangelism. Namely, you're evangelizing people who don't know anything about Jesus or don't know anything about the kingdom of God. You're telling them about the kingdom of God. You're telling them about Jesus, who brings in the kingdom of God and proclaims the kingdom of God. And that prepares people to be Jesus believers, which is very important when God the Father intervenes. And so that's what the harvest is trying to get people who are not yet believers in God, to get them to be believers in God. You're harvesting them like a crop. And the laborers in the harvest are those who work at preaching and teaching the gospel. By the way, remember the speech of Pope Benedict when he was elected Pope. And they said, well, after the pontificate of the great Pope John Paul II, the cardinals chose a simple, humble worker in the vineyard. Well, Cardinal Ratzinger was anything but a humble worker in the vineyard. He was a worker in the vineyard and he was humble, but he was a very major theologian, and he was one of the few that really had the international experience to be the Bishop of Rome. But he could speak of himself as a simple, humble laborer in the vineyard, which you have to kind of smile at that. And then in 10:1 through 16 of Matthew, you have Jesus giving the disciples authority over unclean spirits so that they might cast them out and that they might heal every disease and every sickness. And this is strongly parallel to 9:35. Jesus had the ability to heal every disease and every infirmity. Remember the infirmity? And so what Jesus did in 9:35, the disciples are getting authority to do in 10:1. See? And in Mark, Jesus prefers the term the 12, and he gave them authority over unclean spirits. And in Mark, he gave them authority to cast out unclean spirits. But he does not actually give them the ability to heal every disease and every infirmity in Mark, as in fact he does in Matthew and Luke. And so that could be editorial on the part of Matthew and Luke, see? Then in 2 through 4, you have a listing of the 12 apostles. Mark prefers to call them the 12, although here he does say there is a variant reading in 3:14 of Mark, whom he also or indeed named as apostles. Matthew generally prefers to call them students, disciples. But here at 10:2 in Matthew, they're called apostles, and Luke prefers to call them apostles. An apostolos is somebody who is sent out, an envoy, a commissioned person. In Matthew 10:5 and following, Jesus tells the disciples, do not go in unto the road of the Gentiles, or the road leading to Gentiles perhaps, and into the city of the Samaritans do not enter. In other words, go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And this seems to be in somewhat of a tension, significant tension with the visit of the Magi in 2:1 through 12, and especially the Great Commission, where in the Great Commission he says, make disciples of Panta ta ethne. Make all the Gentiles, the entire bunch of Gentiles, everybody you can, make them disciples. See? So that's a very different ballgame. So that points to this being earlier than the final editor of Matthew. The final editor of Matthew is responsible for the Great Commission, and the final editor of Matthew is responsible for the visit of the Magi. This looks like earlier material. And that's the paradox of Matthew, is Matthew has this perspective of, okay, now let's include the Gentiles. And yet, Matthew includes material prominently that says, okay, Jesus is sent to the Jews, not the Gentiles. Don't go on the road of the Gentiles, and don't go on into the city of the Samaritans. And in the Sermon on the Mount, if somebody is no good, treat that person like a Gentile and a tax collector. A tax collector would be somebody like Matthew. In other words, a collaborator. So the later material, which it makes sense to ascribe to the final editor of Matthew, includes material that is very much in favor of the Gentile mission, whereas the early sources, such as the Sermon on the Mount and Matthew 10, this Q material, says, okay, don't mess with the Gentiles. Go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So you can see there's a tension between Matthew's sources and the final editor of Matthew. By the way, in 10:7 and following, they are to practice an ascetic lifestyle. They're not supposed to be based in any one city. And so these are rural missionaries, and they go out on the road, and they're not supposed to have any equipment, practically at all. Not even a bunch of extra clothing. Certainly no computers and no Greek New Testaments. No digital cameras. They're supposed to go and simply preach and heal and etc., preach the kingdom of God and heal people, cast out demons. And they're rural missionaries, and they're ministering to rural Jewish people out in the sticks. And can you see what a contrast that is between that and the primarily urban mission that St. Paul does in the big cities, the biggest cities he can go to around the Mediterranean Sea. So going back to the historical Jesus, the interest is in rural people out in the sticks, who, by the way, they speak Aramaic. And Paul's mission is to Gentiles. Many of them are Gentiles, and most of them are Gentiles, and many of them were connected with synagogues, and their mother tongue was Greek, like Paul's. And so you can see that in different stages of the church historically, there has been different missions to different people. And then you finally have the material that says, okay, if you're a follower of Jesus, you're going to suffer. And the more you talk about the sufferings of the disciples, you certainly could argue that that speaks in favor of a late first century date of Matthew rather than early first century dates. In other words, if the sufferings described seem more like they are the sufferings that the disciples, certainly after the crucifixion and death and resurrection of Jesus, the more that is the sufferings being described are about the disciples and the less they are about Jesus, that speaks in favor of a later date for Matthew. Then you have the exhortation to fearless confession. Much has been said about that. Let me read that for you. Matthew 10, 26 to 33, which has only a Luke parallel and no Mark parallel. Have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing is secret that will not become known. What I say to you in the dark, tell it in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Note the distinction or the opposite. It's secret now, but in your ministry you're going to uncover it. That to me speaks of the dichotomy between the age now and the age to come. Verse 28, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, and yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father? In other words, if you become a martyr, God's going to know it. See? Even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid, you are of more value than many sparrows. And then verse 32, everyone therefore who acknowledges me before people, I also will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. So we're talking about people being persecuted for being Jesus followers. Verse 33, but whoever denies me before others, I also will deny before my Father in heaven. And so the parallels between Matthew 10, 26 to 33 and Luke 12, 2 through 9 are very close. And so the closer the parallels are between Matthew and Luke, that tends to push you in the direction of, yeah, there was a Q, and yeah, it was written. See? In other words, if there is extreme difference between the Matthew part, the Matthew Q, and the Luke Q, if it's very, very, very different, then you can say, there was editing, or this looks like it was oral. But when the two texts are very close to each other in a literary sense, that speaks in favor of this being a literary, which is to say, written text. Okay, and then there's more to be said about that. Matthew 10, 37 through 39 is a Q, but it is not as close a parallel as other Q passages. But it speaks of persecution, including persecution leading to death, as the fate of the disciples. Don't plan what you're going to say, you see. And it presupposes an apocalyptic framework for Q. because in Jewish apocalyptic literature, you frequently have, as it gets closer and closer to the time of the intervention by God, there will be persecution of the righteous. And eventually, the righteous who have been persecuted, indeed unto death sometimes, they will be eventually vindicated by God. And so this material here fits very well into that standard topic in Jewish apocalyptic literature. So that speaks in favor of that apocalyptic framework, not only being a part of Paul, not only being a part of Mark, but also being a part of some of the material in Q. And then there's other material. Then there's Matthew 11, 1 through 30. But it's material primarily about John the Baptist. And that's one of the interesting things about why is Q interested in John the Baptist? Well, apparently Q is interested in John the Baptist as the forerunner of Jesus. And then, let me see. The disciples of John the Baptist ask Jesus if he is the Messiah, and Jesus responds to the question by saying, look and see for yourselves what's happening. People are being healed, etc. And so I believe that that answer to the disciples of John the Baptist is an affirmative answer to the question about whether Jesus is the Messiah. I think Jesus did think he was the Messiah. Exactly what kind of Messiah, now that's debatable. Then you have more material from Q. And so the parallels between Matthew and Luke, but in Matthew 11, 2 through 27, appear to be very strong parallels. And there's more material from Q in Matthew 11, 25. This is widely thought to be from Q. And then, of course, in 11, 1 through 30, when you look at all of that stuff from 11, 1 through 30, it really does presuppose the wide diversity of Judaism in the time of Jesus. You have different Jewish leaders and different Jewish partisans coming and getting really interested in who Jesus was and what he did. And that includes scribes, who are not just copiers of biblical texts, but are also practically like walking encyclopedias or walking dictionaries or walking lexica, who can say, well, in this it says this, and over here it says that. Chapter divisions didn't exist then, right? But the scribes knew the texts. Then there were the Pharisees. Then there were the Sadducees. The Sadducees didn't believe, according to the Gospels, they didn't believe in angel or spirit or resurrection. And they also were widely thought of as being collaborators with the Romans. Then the Zealots were the switchblade faction. An important book has been written by Martin Hengel called The Zealots. Then the Essenes included the Dead Sea Scrolls people, but we now believe there were other Essenes that were at different places. And among the ones who were Essenes in different places other than at Qumran, that might very well include John the Baptist. He may very well have been an Essene. And then there's the derogatory term, the Am Haaretz. And the Am Haaretz are the country people, the people of the land. And so you really do have a wide diversity of people. Scribes, I mean, that's their job. The Am Haaretz are country people, they're farmers. And then the others are more or less religious partisans. And so if you're not one of those people, you can use that term to, describe in a derogatory way the people. So Judaism was very, very divided along party lines, along geographical lines, and along social lines. The people that the missionaries go to in Matthew 10 are the country people who are never going to be anywhere but in the country. They might go to Jerusalem if they could raise the money to go to Jerusalem. They might practice Judaism in a good way, but a lot of people in Jerusalem probably didn't think so. So you're talking about a wide diversity of Jewish groups and a wide diversity of people who were frequently stymied in different ways because of the Romans, because of the fact that the Romans, the occupation government, the brutal occupation government, was firmly in charge. I have to break it off here, and I had to cover too much in this session. But next week we will study Matthew 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. That's 6 chapters. And we'll have to go at lightning speed.